Hello there, and welcome to week 6, chapter 6 lecture notes. And we are continuing on the theme of uncertainty and looking at some case studies that are describing situations where uncertainty played a big role in the way people responded to them. One of the things to keep in mind this week as we look at uncertainty and we get back to some discussion questions, mostly focusing on the Japanese experience with the tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear meltdown, is this idea that it's not just what happens in a crisis, it's also how people think about it and their perceptions. In the last chapter, chapter 5, mentions very clearly that a great deal of the impact of a crisis can be what people have perceived to be issues, not just the actual events themselves. What this means is that people who are not even touched by a crisis in any kind of physical or material way still think about it in ways that affect their lives, and that there is a lot of the psychology of crisis out there. In fact, after most major disasters, one of the things that happens is psychologists and psychiatrists and other mental health professionals are sent into communities to help people deal with their responses and their feelings about particular crises. And sometimes it's not even the people most tangibly affected by a crisis who have the greatest difficulty in adjusting to or responding to it. So in chapter 6, we have a set of case studies. And what I'd like you to do is you read this material, and I'm not going to provide a real extensive description of every one of them. Read each of these case studies for the purpose of understanding how uncertainty played a role in decision making and impacting the crisis, but also perhaps could affect or could help solve the crisis issue as well. We have a real variety of crises to look at in this chapter. The Tennessee Valley Authority ash slide, a disaster that affected water supply, and uncertainty played a role in the failure of this organization to make good decisions. We have the earthquake in Italy and people's expectations about, maybe rather comically, whether we could actually predict an earthquake, but being able to present an answer to the public that includes uncertainty is not easy to do, and I'll talk a little bit about that with regards to that case study. We've got the General Motors case and their efforts to improve their credibility after mechanical issues with their cars, and Mary Barra, the CEO, testifying in front of Congress and responding to those things. King Car's response to a melamine crisis, a food contamination crisis, was a perfect example of a company trying to overcome uncertainty. Flint, Michigan water contamination case, again, and then the situation in Japan. In each of these case studies, I'm not going to go over them with a lot of detail. I do, however, want you to think about how these case studies remind us about what can happen when uncertainty impacts the way people think and respond to a crisis. Let me just start really quick with the TVA example. The Tennessee Valley Authority's failure to account for the potential for breach of their ash basin and the kind of pollution that would follow it certainly showed their incapacity to address issues that would have led to a more safe environment. A difficult element that occurs in a lot of situations is dealing with the unknown and acknowledging that things could happen that are beyond your control. And uncertainty is something that is hard to sort of program into a response or plan, but in some cases needs to be there. The TVA failed in a lot of respects. What your book does a good job of outlining are some of the breakdowns in the way the TVA thought about a potential crisis, how they planned for it, but also how they reacted to it as well. And one of the difficulties with crises is because they're unexpected in many cases, and they're not the kind of things you can predict, that uncertainty leads to decision making that can be difficult. So when you look at, for example, on page 87, the list of things that they were not prepared to do, shows that not only did they not plan well, but they did not plan for the unplannable or the unexpected. And I think this case study is a really good example of their attempts then to reduce the uncertainty about how the organization will respond the next time they have a crisis, by looking at things like accountability and governance and reviewing and preparing for a potential problem. This case study really shows how, by not thinking about those variables and accepting the variables that could occur, that could combine themselves to create a crisis, led them deeper and made them more vulnerable to a potential breakdown and problem. Now, that community is still dealing with the results of that crisis. And I think it's a really good example of just how an organization needs to incorporate an uncertainty principle in their planning and expertise. The second case study, the earthquake in Italy, is another good example of probably one of the bigger challenges. You can't predict an earthquake. But one of the things that happened, I think, that made people so angry in this case was the all-out claim that it could not happen or would not happen. Sometimes, especially dealing in a crisis situation, communicators have to acknowledge that they don't know everything, that they can't predict everything. They don't know exactly when the crisis might be over, or how bad it will be, or how many people might be injured, or how much it will cost. Now, there's the temptation to have an answer for every question when you respond to a crisis, but you don't often have that. You may not have the time or the resources or the research necessary to respond to a crisis fully. So a lot of organizations have to remember to sort of incorporate uncertainty as part of their message and to embrace it and to accept the fact that uncertainty and uncertain information is there. And so one of the things that most crisis people say is don't overpromise. Don't promise to do something you can't do. Don't promise that your organization, is infallible or would never have something happen again. Being balanced and acknowledging the fact that there are unknown variables is sometimes a benefit. And so, yes, when you make up a promise, there will be no earthquake, and there is, or you won't have another breakdown of your product, and it happens, there's going to be some difficulty. So it's important to include the uncertain as part of your response and acknowledge when you do not have full information or you can't fully promise something that you shouldn't be promising in the first place. The next case study involves General Motors and the breakdown of their product. And in many respects, one of the interesting things about this case is the CEO, Mary Barra. Mary Barra came into kind of the role of the CEO and the head of the company because of this crisis. She was widely praised for her ability to respond to the crisis in front of Congress and to lead the organization and the messaging about this crisis. General Motors allowed faulty ignition switches on their cars for quite a while, and they had a culture that allowed those faulty ignition switches to occur. And the organization had to change their approach. And so, Mary Barra, as she is acknowledged in this textbook, was very open and honest and candid. She communicated very effectively and didn't overpromise, but at the same time assured people that things would get better. And one of the problems with some crises is as they unfold, they get worse, or new information is discovered, or more damaging information is discovered. And I think she handled the twists and turns and bumps of this crisis pretty well. So when your textbook talks about this crisis example, think about what she accomplished in walking into a corporation and a situation that was highly volatile and trying to reassure people that this problem would be fixed and that the culture of the institution would change and that they would acknowledge the fact that decisions that were made were inappropriate. The fourth case study of King Carr, this I've read about this case over the years a couple of times. One of the interesting things about this is here's a company that is importing products from China, products that were contaminated. For 2008, 2007, around this time, there was a lot of contaminated food coming out of China, food products that were adulterated of some kind that had been, in an effort to save money, people, go online sometime and read about fake eggs. There are people out there who make phony eggs and sell them. And in China, there's a lot of what we call fake food. And so the safety of food products was considered unsafe, and the melamine crisis led to death and injury, the death of pets, the death of children, because of kind of large manufacturing of food. They allowed themselves to contaminate it. What King Car did was try to eliminate and reduce the uncertainty that people had about the safety of their food products. And so by recalling them successfully and testing them independently and certifying them and labeling them, they tried to take the fear that people had of the food products that they were producing or importing or borrowing from other places and making it safe. And this is important for companies that have a product like a food ingredient or additive or any kind of potential contamination situation, and creating a set of conditions and standards that would assure people that there would be no future problems or contamination. That could mean, for example, the safety of the paint on toys that come from China. Or there was a controversy in Europe over horse meat that was used as a substitute for beef in prepared meals, and trying to recall and also control contamination became very important. King Car is a very good example of a company that was capable of finding a way to reduce the uncertainty and fear people had about the safety of the food they were buying. In Flint, Michigan, that case study is really, sort of interesting, and this chapter does not do it justice. There are so many things that went into play that caused the contamination and is still impacting that community. But certainly the failure of regulatory agencies to listen, to accept the fact that there was a possible danger, the refusal to acknowledge mistakes that led to the danger increasing and expanding and becoming more severe, shows the inability of people to respond to a crisis in a way that references uncertainty successfully. We are still dealing with that contamination situation, and it really has shown that bad decision making sometimes comes with an inappropriate assessment of risk and consideration for problems that could arise. Failure to acknowledge them led to a great deal of difficulty. The final case study in this chapter involves Fukushima Daiichi, and this is one of those terrible natural disasters that is almost hard to imagine. You have an earthquake, a tsunami, and then a breakdown of their nuclear power safety and plant. Usually we think about a natural disaster as one thing, a tornado or hurricane or flood or one thing or the other, but these things just piled on top of each other. And the series of events that occurred and what your textbook calls interrelated crises led to a terrible danger and could have even led to even greater possibility for problems. It's a wonderful case study in terms of looking at how it unfolds and how people responded over the period of the crisis. So for your consideration, what I would like you to do is there's a link in your website to an episode from a show called Frontline that talks about why this happened and how it happened. What I want you to do is I want you to review what also from chapter 5 about what uncertainty is, and look at the small report or description of the case in your textbook. And I want you to compare those to what the televised report on that nuclear disaster has to say. How do victims respond? How did governments respond? How did the industry respond? to the uncertainty that surrounded them in terms of that particular meltdown situation. So your focus this week in particular is the Japanese example, Frontline Edition, and then now you have this opportunity to discuss it at the end of the week as well. So what are you learning about uncertainty from the Frontline episode? And it's not something they necessarily say explicitly in places, but do you see it and hear it in the description of how people responded, both victims as well as government? How did uncertainty contribute to how the decision-making was done in response? And how do you think victims are treating it? Again, this is one of those crises that still exist, that are still an issue. The dangers of that contamination are still out there, and they're still paying for this crisis. So it's a good opportunity for you to think about how the uncertainty concept, talked about in Chapter 5 and reinforced in our case studies in Chapter 6, help to explain how a crisis can get and become so serious, why they become so critical for us as audiences to know about. Answer those questions, think about uncertainty, and we'll start talking about new topics after this week 6. See you then.